volunteer, or even work at. So that's one option. Another is to share my story, both the direct experience of what I do and have been doing, but in fact, the deeper story of some very cool things that it led to that, who'd have thunk it, as you might say. And then finally, that finding someone historical like Ann Norton, who lived true to herself and devoted her life to her art, to her craft, to being a fine and interesting human, and in fact, leaving a pretty cool legacy. So we're going to jump right in. So this is called the Ann Norton Sculpture Garden. It's a historic home with art galleries now being used as art galleries. There's the studio where Ann Norton did most of her sculpting, and the garden, which is just short of 2 acres. And as I mentioned, it's located in downtown West Palm Beach, Florida, right on the Intracoastal Waterway. Now, the Gardens is now a 501c3 registered foundation, and had the foresight in 1977 when she was diagnosed with cancer. So we're telling you about her demise before we even get into her life. But where she set up a foundation to protect the property. And in fact, she referred to it as an urban oasis. She could already see the development coming down the pike along the waterfront, and she really brought it to life. And that's part of the whole story here, is about bringing history to life, which is a really, really key and wonderful aspect of these sculpture gardens, and something that you can look to find in your own life, a place or a person or a thing or a project you can bring to life. It might even be you yourself that you bring to life by being involved in these kinds of side projects. So Ann Norton herself was born in Selma, Alabama, 1905, and her family was fairly well-to-do. They weren't wealthy, but they were well-to-do enough. They had a summer home out in the country, and she had 3 aunties who were artists. One was a wood carver, one was a stained glass window artist, and one was a painter. And these ladies luckily took a shine to Ann as a youngster, provided her with pencil and sketch pad from early years, a chisel. I think she got her first chisel at about age 7 or 8. And fortunately, they came to her assistance when she made the choice to leave the constraints of Southern living and go north to university. So she chose to go to Smith College, which was far too liberal and feminist for her parents' liking. And so they cut her off financially, and it was these aunts who helped fund her university education at Smith College. So from that point on, she was pretty much on her own. She ended up staying up north in New York City, took on apprenticeships, and was studio assistant to some major sculptors, Archipenko, Zorak, Hovhannes. She worked with and studied with Jose de Kreeft, who became later important in referring her to her next role, which changed the course of her life. And she attended classes at the Art Students League, Cooper Union, places like that had free tuition in New York City. And quite early on, she demonstrated an amazing talent. She was winning contests very early on after graduating from Smith, when her major at Smith wasn't even art. It was comparative religion and cultures. And so she obviously had the knack built in from an early age, or just had a natural talent. And like I said, began winning contests. And in fact, throughout the very difficult Depression years of the 1930s in New York City, Ann was basically the proverbial starving artist, hand to mouth, made smaller sculptures. She couldn't even afford the foundry fees and the materials fees to create sculptures, except on a very small basis. So she was thrilled when she finally started getting commissions for her larger metal bronze sculptures, and was sort of hit in the gut when World War II hit and the Americans began to ration metal, and she couldn't even deliver these orders and sculptures. So that cut her source of income. This is at the point where Ann decided, guess I better go into teaching. And in looking for a job as a teacher, Jose de Kreeft, who she'd studied with, referred her to the Norton Museum of Art. In fact, it was then called the Norton Gallery of Art, which had just opened in 1941 in West Palm Beach, Florida. And they also simultaneously opened a Norton School of Art. And Ann came down, interviewed, got the job, and was teaching there for 6 years. Now, this is the event that changed her life, the course of her life, because there she met the founder, Mr. Ralph Hubbard Norton, and his wife Elizabeth, who had founded the Norton Gallery of Art, and became certainly a respected professional colleague, a confidant in terms of pieces to buy for the Norton Museum itself, Norton Galleries at the time, and they eventually became personal friends. Now, Elizabeth's health wasn't that great, and in 1947 she passed away. And 1948, Ralph, who by then was 72 years old, decided he wanted to share his life with Ann, proposed, and had to deal with her turning him down at first, but in fact, she finally agreed to marry him, and luckily for the public, his wedding gift to her was the studio, and he invited her to just be free to do the work that he'd picked up over the years that she had in mind to do, but the life circumstances hadn't allowed her to do. So she stopped teaching and worked full-time in her studio. Now, they were married 5 years, happy years. They traveled a lot, working in the studio, building sculptures in the grounds over the course of the next, 5 decades. And in that time, what she built were 9 monumental sculptures, 8 of which are created out of brick that she hand molded from clay imported in from either Mexico or North or South Carolina. And she also created an amazing piece called 7 Beings, which captured the kind of, if you look at the 7 faces on these beings, they do look very people-like, except she just put a tail on one of them, according to one of the biographers, so that people wouldn't say they were people. We know she was inspired for this through the hoodoo tall rock formations in Bryce Canyon, but it was a 12-year labor of love, which originally started as a tribute to her husband, and was going to be in bronze and 3 beings, but she switched after being in Bryce Canyon in Utah and extended to 7 beings in stone and much taller. So it became a 12-year project, finished in 1965. Now, Ann, as she approached her later life, continued her contacts in New York City. And this is tying into where I fit in and where I first discovered the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens. And in terms of looking at what happened from reverse, it's a pretty amazing thing. In 2008, I was invited to an event in New Mexico at which I met a cello player who was touting around a movie premiere. And when he found out I lived in the Palm Beach area, I think he sniffed out an opportunity to fundraise. And so he asked if I would put on a concert and a film premiere. And I said, well, I'll help you as long as you speak to students when you come. And so I went looking for a venue. There was no budget. So I stumbled upon the Sculpture Gardens. I was kind of led there. And as I walked through the gardens, I felt a feeling that it was the perfect place. And so I sat down in the garden and thought, now how do I approach the management here about this with no budget? And what do I say? And a whirling dervish came buzzing through and sat down at my table where I was sitting. And I assumed she was another visitor. So when she said, what are you doing here? And I told her, looking for a place for a cello concert and a movie premiere. And she said, what's the movie about? And I told her it's about the friendship between a Tibetan Buddhist monk, the Dalai Lama, and an American Catholic monk, Thomas Merton. And her eyes bugged out. She literally grabbed my arm and said, come with me, and dragged me inside the historic home. There she waved her hand and said, what are all these books doing here? There were 2 full sets of shelves full of books in Tibetan and about Tibet. And I said, okay, now, who are you? Turns out she was the director. And I said, you don't know why these are here? And she said, no. So looking through them, I happened to find an inscription in the front of one of them that said, to our beloved Anne, thank you for many years of friendship and hospitality. And it was, in a few more lines. And then it was signed by Dr. Tubten Norbu, who happened to be the author of the book. So I made contact. I sent a fax of that page to the cello player who lived in California. He called me back in 5 minutes, said, where did you get this, and do you know who it is? And I said, I got it at the place I'm thinking to hold your concert. And no, who is it? He said, this is the eldest brother of the Dalai Lama. So this is where we made the first realization and connection of the fact that Anne had ties to Tibet, and apparently she'd been secretly and quietly supporting Tibetan monks and monasteries over a couple decades, having met Toksta Rinpoche, who became Dr. Tubten Norbu, professor of Tibetan studies at Indiana University. And thereafter, Anne hosted Dr. Norbu, his wife, and 3 kids in her guest house on the estate for almost 20 years. And so nobody knew this part of her past. And I was able to bring photographs in to show the director at the time that what they thought were rocks or perhaps roosters were in fact Tibetan monks in their ceremonial garb. Some of the images were stupas that Anne had seen on her trips to northern India when she met the Dalai Lama twice, and then on into Nepal. We're not sure that she ever made it actually into Tibet. But this opened up a whole new way or aspect of Ann Norton on a spiritual level. She was not herself Buddhist, but I think she found the whole philosophy and the culture fascinating, and you can see the results in the very exotic shapes of her art. So that's one interesting fact or facet about Ann Norton that just came to light in the last 9, 10, or 11 years. And I'm happy to say I was part of facilitating that. Now, the other thing that's cool about Anne is, as I mentioned, on her diagnosis of cancer in 1977, she had created all of these monumental sculptures in her garden. However, the part of the garden where they were located was pretty much scrub pine and scrub oak. There was only a small formal part of the garden. And so Anne, at the time, decided she wanted to convert her private garden into a public space, this urban oasis. She invited another interesting friend of hers who used to winter in Palm Beach. His name was Sir Peter Smithers, obviously British. And he was knighted not because he was a garden designer and an expert in palms, but because he had been involved in so-called diplomatic service during World War II. And when you find out that his boss in this diplomatic service was the one and only Ian Fleming, author of all the James Bond books and movies, you then find out that Smithers was said to be, if not the prototype, then one of the prototypes for James Bond. Anyway, Anne knew him in the capacity of garden designer and as a palm expert. And so together, as her health declined, he helped her design all the pathways that now exist throughout the 1.7 acres of grounds, and brought in to add to the existing palms another bunch of them, so that now there are over 250 species of rare palms, cycads, and other tropical plants. So it's a really fantastic experience, very peaceful, and at the same time thrilling to wind your way through these pathways like you're in a tropical jungle. And then around a corner you go and you come upon this exotic sculpture created by Ann Norton. So I know we don't have much time left together, but I just wanted to tap back into Anne herself. You know, coming up as she did as a